The next thing I'd like to explore is the idea of shading or value with regard to expressing a draped piece of fabric. I think this is something that a lot of students have some trouble with or some anxiety about, but when you think about it and have a technique for tackling it, it is actually a fairly simple thing. And again, I think it's important that we remain with the charcoal because it's very flexible and forgiving in depicting these value relationships that we're going to try to capture from this drape over here. The first thing to notice is that the nature of these shadows on the drape are such that they are light on top and dark where they go behind, and then light on top, dark where they go behind, light on top, dark where they go behind, so that there's a subtle gradation from light to dark, light to dark, light to dark, etc., in sort of a pattern kind of format. So we will express the drape in terms of that kind of shadow pattern. But the first thing we have to do, of course, is establish the basic structure of the drape itself. Again, relying on that searching line technique to sort of pick out the basic outline of the drape. And again, you can see how the searching line is not going to be perfect the first time around. It's an act of discovery, and so I am establishing the nature of the drape, the overall shape of the drape first, before I even think about the light effects. The light effects are a detail. The structure, the shape of the drape is the key thing to establish first. And so I'm establishing these folded, sort of scalloped edges that I'm seeing down at the bottom of the drape, as well as expressing some of the different sorts of details that are happening at the top of the drape regarding the folds as they come across the screen. And I'm actually counting. I've got 1, 2, and here comes the third little folded area that's on top, and I'm using my searching line again. 1, 2, 3. The fourth one is a little bit wider, so again I'm putting that down, and then I've got it coming out here. There's a little bit of a lump there, so I'll go ahead and depict that. Coming across here a little bit further until I get to the very last folded area coming across the top of the screen down here, and it lumps back and goes behind this one. So I'm establishing the basic structure of the drape using that kind of searching line technique to try to establish all of those spatial relationships between the different folds themselves in order to begin. And coming down here. And so now the fun begins, the shading part of the whole ordeal, in which we're going to establish the relationships between these faded areas and light areas. And again, I've got very carefully drawn the shape of my drapery. I'm going to begin by putting shadow into these darker areas where it's going behind a bulging fold there. So I'm just going to pull it down here, thinking about how it's very sharp along that forward edge, and acknowledging the fact that it's not really going to look like much until I establish the pattern. And again, one can use one's finger to manipulate that shadow or value effect, or one can use the eraser a bit more accurately to sort of pull that shadow out from behind that forward bulging fold. Right? So I come down there, and then I can also erase some of these stray marks over here if I want to sort of clean up that first bulging drape. All right. Now I move on to the next in the series, and again I'm going to come through with my little bit of shadow, and remember how we talked about that is a pattern of little shadows emerging from behind the folds, and then on the next series of folds a little shadow emerging from behind the folds. Now one thing that you should begin to notice is that there's a sharp edge to each of these shadows. There's a sharp edge here on the bulging part of the fold, and then on this part it fades out. It fades across. And then there's another sharp edge, and then the shadow fades across. This will happen again here. I'm going to look back, and again I'm going to establish this shadow. This is where the fabric is going behind one of those more bulging folds. And it's fading out across this form. This one's a bigger one, so I'm having to observe down at the bottom exactly what is happening down there. There's a little minor fold in here that I will put in. And again, with the eraser, I'm going to pull that shadow out across the fold so that it has a sort of gradient effect, very smoothly going from light to dark across the form. And as this repetition continues, one begins to see how the folds or fabric drape begins to take shape, begins to feel like it has some volume. Pull this down a little bit. And so you see, especially with the charcoal, it becomes obvious that the use of the eraser is a very big factor in using the medium of charcoal, because it erases so well and blends so well with the use of an eraser. You can really establish some very fine details there. And then sometimes for these studies of drapery, it's interesting to sort of give yourself that sort of background. You notice that this white drape is hung on a black screen, and so the idea that you might add a little extra attention to value at the base of this thing to sort of anchor it in the picture plane and really make you focus on this bottom scalloped edge, which is such a beautiful sort of representation of the fold. And then again, obviously possible to just sort of fade this out a little bit with the eraser, just to give it a more or less soft finish at the bottom. And give us a little focus on the bottom of the drape. And so this idea of the sharp edge to the shadow and the fading of the shadow across a series of folds to depict